The purpose of this segment is to begin discussion of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are one of the main classes of biomolecules. We're following up our discussion of proteins in the last few segments with this discussion of carbohydrates because, like proteins, carbohydrates, being a major class of biomolecules, are going to come into play heavily in the field of chemical biology. And so we'll start with a few examples of types of molecules or examples of molecules that are important to carbohydrates. Then we'll go into some details about the building blocks of carbohydrates. And in later units, later videos, we'll look at how different carbohydrate molecules link together to form elaborate structures. So starting in to look at carbohydrates, we can consider some examples of carbohydrates, such as the so-called aminoglycoside antibiotics. The term aminoglycoside we dissect because the term glycoside here refers to molecules that contain sugar units. Amino refers to the amine functional group. And so as we look at a typical aminoglycoside antibiotic general structure here, as I'm highlighting with my laser pointer, we see the amino groups here, 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 and here, giving it the amino designation. And then glycoside is because we have these carbohydrate groups that are present there, the sugar units that are constructing this. Some aminoglycoside antibiotics that you may have heard of are kanamycin, streptomycin, neomycin, and a variety of other of these mycin antibiotic compounds, some of which you have likely at some point in your life taken as an antibiotic. These have been really useful compounds because they are suitable for understanding how bacterial cells work. They can be used as chemical probes for determining the function of cellular components within bacteria. Additionally, considering our tour of carbohydrates, cellulose is another common carbohydrate that you may have heard of and be familiar with. That is a structural component of plants. So the roles that carbohydrates play are very broad. One of those is a structural component in plants. And what happens there in plants is that there are a large network of repeating D-glucose units, glucose being a very common monosaccharide individual sugar unit that joins together with other sugar units. This in here is hundreds or thousands in size to give a cellulose molecule. And then peptidoglycan is an interesting example of a molecule that contains both carbohydrate components and amino acid components. And peptidoglycan is a constituent of the cell wall of bacteria. And interestingly, in addition to containing these carbohydrate components, which are shown here by these sugar units that I'm circling, these rings, we also have a variety of peptides present that I'm not going into detail here since our purpose is carbohydrates in this unit, that will contain D amino acids, unlike the common L amino acids that are the building blocks of proteins we talked about in the last few videos. So thinking about carbohydrates and some of the fundamentals of these molecules that are super essential to life, much like proteins, carbohydrates are biopolymers. They're built of individual units that share some common themes in those individual units. And when those individual units come together and form covalent bonds, ultimately you end up with a long chain of individual units that can assemble into elaborate functional three-dimensional structures such as cellulose, peptidoglycan, and others. So the analogy that we can draw here is much like amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So we take a bunch of amino acids, go through some reactions, and ultimately end up with proteins. Once those amino acids have linked together into a primary structure, and then that primary structure is folded up into secondary, tertiary, and possibly quaternary structures, you end up with a protein. Similarly, or analogously, with carbohydrates, you have a series of monosaccharide units, individual building blocks, much like amino acids are building blocks of proteins. And those monosaccharides link together through a series of multiple reactions that I'm illustrating with the double arrow here to yield the carbohydrate molecule, the complex entity that is formed by covalently linking a variety of monosaccharides together into very specific structures. So when we think about these building blocks, the individual building block of a carbohydrate being a monosaccharide, these building blocks of carbohydrates are generally much more diverse than the 20 building blocks that make up the proteins. So when we think about proteins, we generally think of the 20 standard L-amino acids with, if you look pretty deeply into biology and biochemistry, there are some additions to those 20, but by and large, 20 standard amino acids. In the case of the monosaccharide building blocks of carbohydrates, those tend to be a lot more diverse, and across the spectrum of life, different organisms can produce different monosaccharides and assemble those into a variety of different carbohydrates. So unlike amino acids versus proteins, where the 20 amino acids are relatively universally needed, with monosaccharides, there is more diversity across different types of organisms in the spectrum of life. And those different monosaccharides assemble into the functional carbohydrates. So the other thing that we can think about when we think about the building blocks of carbohydrates is monosaccharides being very diverse relative to the number of amino acids, meaning there's much more than 20 different monosaccharides, unlike there only being 20 standard amino acids. Additionally, in contrast to joining links between amino acids to form peptide bonds, where there was one linkage type that formed, that was the amide bond or the peptide linkage. Instead, when we're thinking about joining monosaccharides together to form carbohydrates, there are many themes, many ways that the units link together. So they link covalently, form covalent bonds in multiple ways to yield carbohydrates, to yield that carbohydrate product. Not just amide linkages like we were seeing for amino acids. Instead, there are multiple themes that we can see, and we'll get into some of those themes a couple of videos down the road. What we will see for monosaccharides is that the general formula that monosaccharides have is, the typical formula is CnH2n ON, where N is an integer. And I should add that this formula applies only to so-called open chain carbohydrates, or open chain monosaccharides, to be more specific to what we're talking about right here. And when we use the term open chain monosaccharide, what that means is we're looking at a linear monosaccharide, not a ring structure. So the compounds that we see here, here, and here as our examples all have the carbohydrates forming these ring structures. In the case of each of these, it's 6-membered rings. That's not always the case, but 6-membered rings are pretty common amongst carbohydrate structures. Open chain refers to a chain where we have not formed that ring. So an example would be, for example, the open form of D-glucose, represented here, that I'm drawing out. And you don't need to memorize the specific structure of D-glucose here, but I'm using it as an example for this particular scenario. So this would be an example of an open chain monosaccharide. So in the case of this structure, if we were to count the number of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, we would see that since there are a grand total of 6 carbon atoms, remember that each intersection of these lines represents a carbon, then you have the carbon here and carbon here. So there's 6 carbons, so C, 6 would get filled in here as N, and then 2N would be 12. So there's 12 hydrogens in this open chain form. And then ON means that the number of oxygens is equal to the number of carbons. So 6 carbons implies you will find 6 oxygen atoms here. And that's the theme that we're going to see for these carbohydrate building blocks, these monosaccharides, is that they are in the acyclic form, the open chain form, in other words, that you're going to see this theme take place. When they form the ring structures, which we'll get into in the next video or so, the mechanism for how those ring structures form. When they form those ring structures, there is going to be a deviation from this general formula. So this is only going to apply to the open chain monosaccharides that we can look at. So we will keep those points in mind. In the next unit, what we are going to do is discuss some ways that we can go about classifying these monosaccharides, the building blocks of carbohydrates. And then we're going to go into how we can join together monosaccharide units to form these complex molecules, these carbohydrate structures, such as the ones that are highlighted here. So we will get into that as we go into the next unit. So stay tuned for that, and we'll go from there.